Tonight our focus is going to be on climate justice, and we have respected journalist and climate activist Wen Stephenson, who's going to inform us all on the topic. And now it's my pleasure to turn everything over to Tim Weissel, who's also a member of our board, but he's an environmentalist who teaches at the Harvard Extension School.
An independent journalist and climate activist, Wen Stephenson is a contributing writer for The Nation and author of What We're Fighting For Now Is Each Other, dispatches from the front lines of the climate justice struggle, actually, of climate justice itself.
Before I really start, I just want to say that tonight is certainly not about me or even this book. I know that isn't what Beacon Press wants to hear, but that's okay. They're sitting out there. In fact, my editor, Alexis Rizzuto, who's also a strong member of 350 Massachusetts, is sitting right out there. But no, so I wrote a book. It's just a book. It's just one imperfect book, words on pages. What I really want us to consider tonight is why we're really here. Why are you here? It's about what's happening to our world and to the people in it. So if you wouldn't mind, just for a moment, I'd like us to observe a moment of silence for the victims of climate change, of climate injustice, of injustice everywhere, whether right now in Charleston, South Carolina, or in Roseburg, Oregon, or in Afghanistan, or Syria, or Ferguson. Thank you. So it's a little surreal to be standing in this particular church right now. And it's not only because it's across the street from my freshman dorm, where literally across the street, Massachusetts Hall, where last April I spent a sleepless night on the pavement in front of my freshman entry with some very hardy students from Divest Harvard, some of whom are sitting right up here in the front row, and several alumni trying to convince Harvard University to divest from fossil fuels. There's that, but it's really even more because, on the last day of August in 1837, that's right, 1837, the American philosopher, poet, transcendentalist, abolitionist, and radical preacher, a man who once got himself banned from Harvard for what Harvard considered heresy. I mean, of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson, stood in this very church and delivered the address that we know as the American Scholar, the speech that Oliver Wendell Holmes called America's intellectual Declaration of Independence. And as it happens, one of the graduating seniors that year, a member of the Harvard class of 1837, was a young man named Henry Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau. Although I'm going to call him Thoreau, because Thoreau is just too ridiculously pretentious. And of course, when you think about Thoreau, you may be saying to yourself, yeah, sure, Walden Pond, nature, climate change, I get it. Wasn't he basically, our first environmentalist? Well, actually, no. Thoreau was a great naturalist. He may even have been our first ecologist. But Henry David Thoreau, the icon of the American environmental canon, was not a quote-unquote environmentalist, a term that would have meant nothing to him. What he was, however, without question, was a radical abolitionist. He was what we would call a human rights activist. In fact, Thoreau's great subject in Walden and just about everything he wrote wasn't the environment or even nature. It was how to live as a human being in relation to both nature and other human beings, because the two can't really be separated. I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, Thoreau wrote in the opening line of his great essay, Walking. And he went on to regard man as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of nature. That essay was first delivered as a pair of lectures, Walking and the Wild, beginning in the spring of 1851, in the midst of the uproar over the fugitive slave law, as northern states, including this Commonwealth, sent free human beings back into slavery. And in that essay, Thoreau writes, above all, we cannot afford not to live in the present. Unless our philosophy hears the cock crow in every barnyard within our horizon, it is belated. There is something suggested by it that is a newer testament, the gospel according to this moment. Where we hear that cock crow, where we hear that gospel preached, Thoreau goes on, quote, no fugitive slave laws are passed. Or as he later put it in his fiery abolitionist address, Slavery in Massachusetts, nature has been partner to no Missouri Compromise. For Henry Thoreau, who together with his mother and his sisters was deeply involved in the Underground Railroad, who personally sheltered and escorted escaped slaves to safety in defiance of that fugitive slave law, and who risked his own neck smuggling one of John Brown's fellow Harper's Ferry conspirators out of Concord to the train for Canada, a man who had a price on his head. For Henry Thoreau, to live in harmony with nature was to act in solidarity with his fellow human beings. The gospel according to this moment. 2 years before he wrote that line, in 1849, he preached that newer testament in the radical abolitionist essay called Resistance to Civil Government, better known today as Civil Disobedience. And in that essay, Thoreau insists that we recognize those situations, quote, in which a people, as well as an individual, must do justice, cost what it may. He goes on in the very next lines to offer a stark analogy. If I have unjustly wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it to him, though I drown myself. From that straight-up, no-nonsense formulation, Thoreau lays down a marker, a point from which he'll navigate. Action from principle, he tells us. The perception and the performance of right changes things and relations. It is essentially revolutionary. Let your life, he goes on, let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. Now, if slavery was the greatest human moral catastrophe of Thoreau's time, as it surely was, then global warming and its destruction of countless innocent lives, the vast majority of them impoverished people of color, historically and presently oppressed under the legacy of that very same slavery and colonialism, a global economic system built on white supremacism, the very same economic system now driving climate change. Then global warming is the greatest human moral catastrophe of our own time. If I have unjustly wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it to him, though I drown myself. Action from principle is essentially revolutionary. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. So, this is a book launch, so I thought I might read a little bit from the book. Would that be okay? Mount Auburn Street, a block south of Harvard Yard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with its brick sidewalks, its exclusive old boy college clubs, and its late Victorian Gold Coast dorms, is about as far as you can get from the piney woods of East Texas. Unless, that is, you find yourself sitting on an ancient cast-off sofa in the small, dimly lit library of a former fraternity house, sunlight and street sounds filtering through lowered blinds, where a group of young people plot nonviolent direct action at the suburban offices of TransCanada Corporation, in solidarity with the tar sands blockade, fighting construction of the southern leg of the Keystone XL pipeline through East Texas. Then you're practically in Nacogdoches. That room is where I found myself on an afternoon in December 2012. I was there not as a journalist, but to help the organizers, mostly students and recent grads from nearby schools, with media outreach and communications. It was the first time I'd been on the inside of a well-planned civil disobedience action. The first time I'd felt the tingle of adrenaline and the faint undercurrent of anxiety that comes from participating in an act of principled resistance where power would be confronted, laws would be broken, and people would go to jail. Nervous laughter punctuated the bewildering logistical checklist. This would be no ordinary sit-in. I listened with fascination as kids 25 years younger than me, utterly in control, spoke of jewelry or hardware. In the present instance, the hardened steel chains and locks they would use to secure themselves to each other once inside the corporate office. I'd gotten to know several of the students and 20-somethings over the past summer and fall, working alongside them in the Boston area climate movement. But in that room, that afternoon, they appeared suddenly older, mature beyond their years, and uncommonly brave. All of my young friends were acutely aware of their privilege, and yet all of them were fighting for what they called climate justice, and not only for poor and vulnerable people in faraway places, but more and more for themselves and for one another. They felt themselves, people of their generation and younger, threatened and oppressed by powerful, corrupt forces far beyond their control. They grasped the urgency and scale of the climate catastrophe and understood the role of the fossil fuel industry and its political enablers, not only in obstructing any serious efforts to deal with the crisis, but in actually accelerating us toward the climate cliff. They quoted the alarming reports from the International Energy Agency, stating that continued global investments in fossil fuel infrastructure past 2017 would lock in catastrophic warming. And from the World Bank, which had recently declared that humanity is on course for warming of 4 degrees Celsius this century, above the pre-industrial average, likely beyond our civilization's ability to adapt. They saw the catastrophic trajectory to which their elders have condemned them, and they felt something like desperation, forced onto a radical path by the political and moral failures of older generations. And their analysis was and is painfully accurate. At this late hour, to be serious about our climate reality is to be radical. I wondered then, and I often still wonder, if young people like these, and those I've met in Texas, are the only people in this country with the guts and maturity to accept what that means. And so it was that on the morning of January 7th, 2013, 8 of my young friends, supported by perhaps a dozen or more organizers of varying ages and experience, and with an increasingly galvanized and resolute national movement behind them, walked into the Trans-Canada Suite on the 2nd floor of a nondescript office park among the strip malls along Route 9 in Westboro, Massachusetts. "This is a peaceful protest," they announced to the receptionist, and then sat down on the floor, facing outward in a tight circle, locked themselves together with those heavy-duty chains around their waists and ankles, and joined hands, bound with super glue. That final youthful flourish ensured headlines like Boston.com's. Protesters glue themselves together at Westboro office of the company building Keystone Pipeline. Their names were Emily Edgerly, a 20-year-old sophomore at Tufts, Devin Powell, a 20-year-old Tufts junior, Lisa Purdy, a 20-year-old junior at Brandeis, Shay Reister, a 22-year-old Brandeis graduate, Ben Thompson, a 22-year-old grad student in mathematics from Boston University, Ben Trolio, a 21-year-old senior at the University of New Hampshire, Allie Welton, a 20-year-old sophomore at Harvard, and Dorian Williams, a 21-year-old senior at Brandeis. On the carpet, just inside the reception lobby's glass doors, they spread a banner that read, "Stop the KXL pipeline now." In the photo taken by their support team and distributed to the press, they're sitting in that circle on the floor, dressed as though for job interviews. 8 polite young people concerned for their future. "We stand together as representatives of a desperate generation," they wrote in a statement posted on their website. "Today we hope to present our political leaders with an example of the courage needed to confront the climate crisis by putting our bodies in the way of corporations whose activities threaten our society." They acted in solidarity not only with the tar sands blockade in Texas, but also the First Nations peoples of Canada, resisting the extraction of the Alberta tar sands and the poisoning of their sacred ancestral waters and land. And the students wrote, because the tar sands represent even greater destruction to come from unabated climate change, they acted, quote, "in solidarity with all humanity." Their principles didn't seem to impress the Westboro police. 2 months later, more than 100 of their friends and supporters, including me, went back to Westboro where 25 people, carrying a mock coffin and singing "They're Digging Us a Hole," a foot-stomping dirge written for the occasion by a band called Melodigo, sat down at the entrance to the Trans-Canada Suite and were arrested. Four members of the Westboro Eight are actually here with us tonight. Devin Powell, Ben Thompson, Ben Trolio, and Shay Reister. In the summer of 2012, approximately 80% of the so-called permanent Arctic sea ice, measured by volume, was gone, melted. The speed at which the Arctic is melting far exceeds what the models predicted. And the stability of the global climate system depends on the Arctic. This is really happening. The Arctic and the glaciers are melting. The oceans are rising and acidifying. The corals are bleaching. The great forests dying and burning. The storms and floods, the droughts and heat waves are intensifying. The farms and savannas are parched and drying. Nations are disappearing. People are dying. Mass extinction is unfolding. And all of it sooner and faster than science predicted. The window in which to prevent the worst scenarios is closing before our eyes. And the fossil fuel industry, which holds the fate of humanity in its carbon reserves, has doubled down economically and politically on all this destruction. We face an unprecedented situation, a radical situation. It demands a radical response, a serious response. Now, any discussion like this must begin by acknowledging the science and the sheer lateness of the hour, that our chance for any smooth, gradual transition has passed. We have to acknowledge the fact that without immediate action at all levels to radically reduce greenhouse emissions and decarbonize our economies by mid-century, requiring a society-wide mobilization and a thus far unseen degree of global cooperation, leading to the effective end of the fossil fuel industry as we know it. Without all of that, the kind of livable and just future we all want is simply inconceivable. So the question now is not whether we're going to, quote, stop global warming or, quote, solve the climate crisis. It is whether humanity will act quickly and decisively enough to salvage civilization itself in any form worth salvaging. Whether any kind of stable, humane, and just future, any kind of just society is still possible. And it is still possible. What the world's climate and energy experts want us to understand is that the barriers, insurmountable as they may seem, are no longer technological or financial. They're political, which is to say, they're moral. Let's be clear. Given what we know and have known for decades about climate change. Indeed, given what we now know, ExxonMobil has known for decades about climate change. To deny the science, deceive the public, and obstruct any serious response to the climate catastrophe is to willfully allow the eradication of entire countries and cultures. It is to rob people, starting with the poorest and most vulnerable on the planet, of their land, their homes, their livelihoods, even their lives, and their children's lives, and their children's children's lives, for profit and for political power. There's a word for this. These are crimes. They are crimes against the earth, and they are crimes against humanity. So where does this leave us? I mean, what is the proper response to something like that? Remain calm, we're told. No scare tactics or hysterics, please. Cooler heads will prevail. Enjoy the Earth Day festivities. I'm sorry. The cooler heads have not prevailed. It's been a quarter century, nay, 30 or more years since the alarm was sounded. The cooler heads have failed. And so I ask, in the face of this situation, in the face of, let's name it, despair, how does one respond? How does one respond? So, rather than retreat into various forms of denial and fatalism and cynicism, more and more people, and especially a young generation of activists, though not only young people, a lot of us geezers as well, have reached the conclusion that something more than merely environmentalism and virtuous green consumerism is called for. That the only thing offering any chance of averting an apocalyptic future and of getting through what's already coming with our humanity intact is the kind of radically transformative social and political movement that has altered the course of history in the past. A movement like those that have made possible what was previously unthinkable, from abolition to civil rights, to women's rights, to gay rights, all of these human rights struggles that are still not finished, just as ours will never be finished. The mainstream, Washington-centered, big green environmental movement has failed. We've already lost the climate fight. If that means solving the climate crisis and saving some semblance of the world we know. Remember that 80%. It was lost before it began because it got started so late. It's time now to fight like there's nothing left to lose but our humanity. But where does the courage and the commitment and the sacrifice required for that kind of fight, for the kind of really radical movement that we need, actually come from? What I've found in the stories of the people profiled in this book and many, many other people that I have come to know, many in this room tonight, is that the climate struggle, like so many struggles of the past, is essentially a spiritual struggle. That there is a spiritual crisis at the heart of the climate crisis, because it forces us to confront the deepest, most difficult questions about ourselves. The climate catastrophe is so fundamental that it strikes to the root of who we are. It's a radical situation, and it requires a radical response. But not radical necessarily in the conventional sense of ideology. Rather, it confronts us with a kind of radical necessity, a moral necessity. It requires us to wake up, to face the facts, to find out who we really are, and to act. In some cases, to lay everything on the line: our relationships, our reputations, our careers, our bodies, maybe even our lives. So in this book, I've merely written from my own experience, my own personal journey into the climate movement in the United States, about a few of the people I've come to know who've committed their lives, and at times, some of them risked everything, to help inspire and build a more powerful and enduring movement in this country. People who have honestly confronted despair. A despair fully justified by our situation, and yet somehow have found the resolve to keep fighting. So let me just mention a few of them. People on the one hand like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, leading thinkers of our movement. But also people like the pioneering environmental justice scholars Robert Bullard at TSU, at Texas Southern University in Houston, and Beverly Wright at Dillard University in New Orleans, and the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. People truly on the front lines, like the environmental and racial justice leaders Hilton Kelly in West Port Arthur on the Texas Gulf Coast, and Judith Nieto, and Brian and Juan Parras in East Houston. Okay? The people of the burgeoning Climate Justice Alliance, creating a grassroots democratic movement in hard-hit communities, usually communities of color and indigenous communities who are fighting for a just transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And young people like Matt Almonte from New Jersey and Grace Cagle from Fort Worth of the tar sands blockade, who literally risked their lives in the struggle to stop the southern leg of the Keystone Pipeline. And the people of the Austin Heights Baptist Church in Nacogdoches, a white middle-class evangelical church who took those radical young blockaders into their homes like family and fed them and comforted them and loved them. People like Ken Ward and Jay O'Hara, who's sitting out here tonight, who risked prison to block a coal tanker and its 40,000 tons of coal at Brayton Point in Somerset, using a small wooden lobster boat they christened the Henry David T. And people like an activist named Tim DeChristopher, now a student at Harvard Divinity School, who served nearly 2 years in federal prison for what stands as one of the most creative and iconic acts of nonviolent resistance anyone can remember, disrupting and ultimately blocking a corrupt federal auction of oil and gas drilling leases on tens of thousands of acres of public land in southern Utah, and who told the federal judge at his sentencing, "This is what love looks like, and it will only grow." So this book represents no more and no less than my own search for the moral and spiritual well springs of that kind of courage and commitment, and my search for what the very idea of climate justice at this late hour might yet mean. So, if you think about it, that last idea, what climate justice might yet mean, it's another way of asking what we're fighting for, right? There are those, even in the climate movement, who don't really like to talk about justice. They don't really like to talk about race. They don't really like to talk about inequality, whether economic or social or sexual. They don't like to talk about the distribution of wealth at the national level, much less the global level. Whereas Pope Francis recently reminded us so powerfully, we owe the developing world, the majority of the world's people, a massive ecological and climate debt. Or the fact that women, in particular, bear the brunt of climate change globally. That when we say those oft-repeated words, the poorest and most vulnerable, more often than not, that means a woman. Indeed, a woman of color. Now look, I don't really like to talk about these things either, because they put me on the spot. It's uncomfortable to talk about the systems, the structural forms of oppression that lie at the root of this crisis and prevent us from honestly addressing it, especially when, like me, you're among those who have benefited most, whether you ever wanted to or not, from those very systems. And yet, if I'm serious about justice, if I'm serious about climate, morally serious, then I have to face these things. The truth is, given what's coming, given that 80%, our fights for social justice and for a real democracy matter more than ever. When we stare our climate reality in the face and we see the storms that we, and especially our children's generation, are heading into, scarcity, instability, conflict, and what those with wealth and power are prepared to do to hold on to that wealth and power, it matters more than ever what kind of government, what kind of a democracy, what kind of a constitution, what kind of a society we have as we head into that future. Okay, so I've been talking for a while now. I started out by mentioning Ralph Waldo Emerson and the address he delivered in this church. So I want to close now by reading a passage from the near the end of the book that takes us back to another church in another century and another speech by another American philosopher, poet, transcendentalist, abolitionist, and yes, radical preacher. On April 4th, 1967, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. rose to speak from the pulpit of the Riverside Church in Manhattan's Morningside Heights, a church built by John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, and delivered what was perhaps the boldest, most radical speech of his too short life. Daring to denounce the war in Vietnam as a national sin eating away at the American soul, and prophetically proclaim the war's inseparability from the struggles for racial and economic justice, King knew that he would alienate, maybe even lose, some of his strong allies, many of whom were not yet willing to break with Lyndon Johnson and the still pro-war liberal establishment. People would ask him, he noted, "Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Peace and civil rights don't mix. When he heard this, King said that day, he was, quote, greatly saddened. For such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. That commitment and calling, he reminded them, was that of a Christian preacher. Now, King had just written his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? To be published that June. And in those pages, as in his speeches during those last 2 years, King struggled to reinvigorate and reunite the civil rights movement, which was coming apart at the seams over black power and nonviolence, separatism and integration, and over how fast and how hard to push for economic justice and against the war in Vietnam. And while he's often cast these days as a soothing moderate, it's important to remember just how radical King was, especially at the end of his life. Establishment critics, including the NAACP, thought that he should keep his focus on race and civil rights and not stick his nose into what they considered the separate issues of labor, poverty, and most of all, the war. But King understood that all of these issues were at a profound level interconnected. He saw their intersectionality. He knew, as he wrote in a Birmingham jail cell in 1963, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He saw systemic evil and knew it required a systemic solution. He saw and argued forcefully that the, quote, unholy trinity of racism, poverty, and war were at root one and the same, that they are all forms of violence, that they all grow from, quote, man's inhumanity to man, and can only be defeated by universal love. A genuine revolution of values, King declared at Riverside Church in a passage drawn from the final pages of that new book, means in the final analysis that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation, he continued, is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all mankind. This oft misunderstood, this oft misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the niches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of man. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. At which point, the Baptist preacher quoted from the first epistle of St. John, chapter 4. Let us love one another, for love is of God. Of course, it's easy for me to stand here and quote Martin Luther King and feel good about myself for doing so. But there's nothing easy about the path he showed us and the gospel he preached. As with Thoreau, we who invoke King need to ask ourselves if we're really ready to walk in his footsteps. King was a radical and a revolutionary, ready to give his life in the cause of justice. When those of us who appropriate his words can say the same, then maybe we can claim some tiny portion of his legacy. The title of King's last book poses the question facing us now. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? We know that the crimes perpetrated against the planet today are a form of violence against our fellow human beings, a profound racial and economic and generational injustice on a global scale. And we know that if we're going to have a movement big enough and powerful enough to confront this, we have to come together across our cultural, racial, economic, and generational divides, even our ideological divides. Nothing about that task is easy. But if there's to be any hope of such solidarity, then climate justice will need to be defined broadly enough, inclusively enough, to encompass everyone, not only our own communities and our own children, my own children, but everyone, everywhere, including generations not yet born, in order to keep even the possibility of justice alive on earth. Because what we're fighting for now is each other. We have to fight for the person sitting next to us and the person living next door to us, for the person across town and across the tracks from us, and for the person across the continent and across the ocean from us. Because we're fighting for our humanity. That's what solidarity is. That's what love looks like. Not simply a fight for our own survival. There are oppressive and dystopian forms of survival that aren't worth fighting for. Indeed, that are worth fighting against. Rather, ours is now a fight for survival and a fight for justice, for the survival of the possibility of justice and some legitimate hope for what King called the beloved community, even as we struggle just to survive. Our fight is against chaos and for community, and it cannot wait. There at Riverside Church, King spoke words that would appear in the final paragraph of that final book. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. Is it too late? We know what the science says. What does your conscience say? What does too late even mean? Too late for what? Even in the face of all we now know, will it ever be too late for some kind of faith in human decency? Or to hold on to some kind of hope, however irrational it may seem, in our fellow human beings? Or to love our brothers and sisters on this earth? Because these things, faith and hope and love, are every bit as real as the science, every bit as real as the CO2 in the atmosphere and the carbon in the ground, as real as the melting Arctic and the acidifying oceans. And as Dr. King knew, these things, faith, hope, love, are the very stuff that movements are made of. Real movements. The kind of radical, transformative movements that have changed the course of history in the past. And maybe, just maybe, might change it again. If enough of us are willing to fight, and to fight hard enough, and to fight lovingly enough, and never give up. If we're willing to engage in this struggle, this radical and loving struggle for each other. Thank you very much.
I was struck by the power of your book, starting with a kind of metaphor of awakening, which is very much based on a kind of personal conversion experience in your own circumstance. Do you think everyone has to go through that kind of conversion experience in order to be authentically engaged?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, well, I don't know. I mean, who am I to say? But one of the things I've noticed and learned about so many people in this movement, the people that I wrote about, one of the true revelations for me of the reporting of the book was the way that the people who seem the most committed to the fight, to the struggle, have been through that. I mean, and it has been, in many, many cases, probably all cases, a kind of spiritual struggle. People who have, as I say, honestly confronted the despair of the situation, and yet have emerged on the other side of it somehow, with the resolve that it takes to get up in the morning and, do this work. So, yeah.
Sir.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My name is Ambrose Spencer, and I learned about climate change in 1959 from my math teacher. But I had no idea after the 40 years of study that I put in that we'd find ourselves today where we are. I feel like a fool having spent all that time preparing, and now I'm 74. The question I have to ask has to do with martyrdom. Martyrdom. Ever since Vatican II opened up the door to liberation theology in Latin America around the world, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of people or more in Latin America alone who have said what they believe to be true about God and about what that faith requires them to do, knowing full well that the powers that be of dependency and domination will put them to death to silence them. My question is this: in your work and in your conversations with the people that you know, tell us a little bit about those conversations, about what the feelings are and what the visibility of love is like when people start to talk. I want to know this personally for my own reasons. When people start to talk about being prepared to give their lives, in fact, for this. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. So, first of all, I should thank you for that very profound question. I should make clear that I don't believe that most people I know are, even those who are the most passionately committed to this, are at that point of, truly giving their lives. Although I will say, I'll lay it on the line. I do know people, some young people, who have literally asked me, okay, confessed to me, that they have considered, well, maybe it would make a difference if I, self-immolated in front of Congress. What do you say to that? No, please, don't do that. One of the most shocking moments for me in reporting this book was in an interview with Tim DeChristopher, when, he said to me, and he's probably right, that if we're serious about this and the kind of movement that it's going to take to actually overturn the sort of government that we have, activists will lose their lives at some point, sometime. So I'm not asking anybody to go out and risk their lives. I'm not asking anybody to risk that or do anything like that. But, there is a level of commitment of not risking your life necessarily or being willing to die, but to commit your life, right? And I think that is what was so inspiring to me about the people in this book, is that every one of them has done that, They have truly, truly committed their lives.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm in a way sorry to shift the sort of tenor of my away from the beautiful spiritual and moral tone of all of your remarks. But you said in the very beginning that bringing about change is a political. And so I want to ask a question about politics in its worst form, namely the election campaign that we're going to be living with for the next 13 months. Do you have any suggestion of how that can be used? In other words, what kinds of questions would you want to ask at any of the meetings, anywhere in this country, where people are gathering to listen to, but also get a chance to address questions to candidates?
Well, I don't know if I have, thank you, good question. I don't know that I have the specific questions to suggest, for the candidates, but what I want to hear, what I want to see is an honest conversation. Forget on the right, okay? Forget on the right. I want to hear an honest conversation on the left about what we're actually facing, okay? About what the science says the situation really is, about what it would actually take to address it in a serious way, and then what the consequences are, the human consequences are of our failure to do that. Okay, that is not happening. When I think of that kind of honest conversation at the political level, I think of there are sins of commission and sins of omission. All right. So the right, the climate deniers, they're committing sins of commission. Right. They're telling outright lies. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, don't do that so much, but they're guilty of sins of omission. They talk about what a serious problem climate change is, but they leave out, the most important parts. Okay, they're leaving out the enormous gap. Okay, what's known as the ambition gap. That's what it's called at the UN, right? The ambition gap between what the science says is necessary. Okay, the kind of truly radical emission cuts that we need, right? I mean, let's get into it, right? Okay, so Obama's pledge, he upped it, right? He went from, 17% below 2005 levels by 2020 or 2025 now, to 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Okay, well, actually, the agreed upon international baseline year is not 2005, it's 1990, all right? And, the IPCC has always said that we need really more like 40% cuts below 1990 levels by then, all right? And the EU, by the way, is kind of more or less sort of committing to that, right? Okay, well, when you do the math, I mean, we're not even talking about cutting US emissions by 10% below 1990 levels by that time, all right? And this historic, truly historic deal with China that was announced, earlier this year, which is truly significant. It is, because nothing like it existed before. But still, China has agreed to, cap its emissions, to stop growing its emissions by 2030. All right. So we're nowhere near where we need to be, but we're not talking about that. Okay. We're only talking about it within the very constricted terms of our mainstream politics. So what I want to hear is actually an honest conversation about this at the political level. And, I don't really know why Bernie Sanders isn't the one injecting it into the conversation. Come on, where is Bernie on this? As one of my friends in the movement has told me recently, what we really need to do is blow the doors off this thing, We need to blow this whole thing up.
Well, you need to blow the frame off it that's given in policy circles usually. And you can do that simply with a reframing of the problem. If someone asks you what time it is, you can just say, well, it's 8:20 on a Wednesday evening in the terminal Cenozoic, the end of the age of mammals. Figure it out from there.
Works for me. All right.
Thank you very much for a very compelling presentation that touched on many, many subjects beyond just climate change, but also morals and ethical issues. We are talking conflict here, and conflict between people who want change and people who don't want change. And that's a very human thing. People don't like change. People like things the way they were. That's a human thing. Some people see the need for change, and others question as to why. In a part of a conflict resolution, you need a dialogue. And it's like in peace and conflict resolution, for example, the techniques that are being used there is to get the most protagonist people somehow to a point where they realize they need to talk to each other. Once you get to that point, then things will happen. And somehow the trick is, how do you get them to the point? If you look at political situations like the Northern Ireland conflict, for example, that's the technique used that brought the Protestants and the Catholics together by getting the most extreme people to get to talk to each other that would not want to be in one room together in their normal lives or would shoot each other. So it seems to me that in a way, the same thing needs to happen with this theme. And what can you foresee to get the protagonists to that point? And what can be done to be constructive in that way? Thank you. If you could speak to that a bit. Thank you.
I mean, we got to think about who those people are. It's really hard to imagine sitting down and having that kind of a conversation with somebody who doesn't even accept just the baseline kind of premise of the whole conversation, which is the reality of climate science and the reality of the situation. It's also hard to imagine having that kind of conversation with someone who is completely unwilling to even discuss any sort of activist government intervention in the market or whatever. So we're at a point where we're truly at loggerheads, And personally, I don't think we're ever going to convert the sort of ideologues on the right or even in the center who are unwilling and unable to deal with this, all right? I think we actually have to defeat them, right? And the way we defeat them is we grow our numbers of the people who are willing to struggle for this, all right? So, you know, negotiation is nice, but you have to have a negotiating partner, and we don't have one.
Thank you very much for raising it as a human rights issue. I think it's often said the trouble with the climate movement was it started out as an environmental issue. And I'm thinking right now about the millions and millions of refugees around the world. And right now, of course, all of these people coming into Europe, and you know, the idea that the drought in Syria was a major cause of all of this. And I wonder if there's some way in which we need to be much more framing the present and the future in terms of, you know, we're already talking probably 25, 30 million climate refugees around the world, one way or another. If that's a way in which we can sort of help arouse people's moral sense in a way that it hasn't been.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't really know how to answer that. I could run with it, but we're maybe running out of time. But absolutely, I mean, what you point to is a classic example of the human impact of this crisis. And you know, it's interesting. Just I will note, it is interesting that the international community is really not prepared to deal with this. People who are uprooted. Who move, who leave their homes, leave their country because of drought or other climate impacts are not actually legally considered refugees under international law. So that gives you an idea of how far we still actually have to go to where we're able to deal with this. But I will also say that when Germany starts accepting those people from Syria and elsewhere, you know, that's a little bit of what climate justice looks like.
Thank you for attending.
This is the story of our ancestors as we choose to tell it. And so, of course, it's our story too.